Good afternoon. Welcome. It is a pleasure for us to have you here with us in Casa Árabe with these conferences regarding Sharia or Islamic law. In this conference, we've had seven different sessions because in the opening session we had two different conferences, and we also have Ms. Delfina Serrano with us today. And we have the pleasure of having Mr. Muhammad Khalid Masud, and he will talk to us about the theory and the objectives of Sharia uh, regarding the expert al-Shatibi al-Ghanati. I would like to welcome Delfina. She is the scientist coordinator for this cycle, and Mohammed, because he was kind enough to accept our invitation to participate in this cycle. And I would like to welcome all of you following us in YouTube and Facebook and the different social media in Casa Árabe. I would like to give the floor first to Delfina for the presentation of Mr. Khalid Masud. Good afternoon. Thank you, Javier, for your kind words, and thank you to Casa Árabe as well for having organized these conferences regarding Sharia. And I would like to thank also our followers and those following this conference in YouTube and in social media. And I would also like to thank Professor Mohammed Khalid Masud. It is an honor to have you here with us. So you were very kind because you accepted the invitation to participate in this conference. Obviously, it's very important to have different experts for our conferences, and in this case, we have with us a real expert on the field. One of the most important experts when it comes to the analysis and study of Sharia, and he has this very international reputation, but he is also someone who participates, as we will see, in the application of Sharia. Currently, Dr. Muhammad Khalid Masud is a judge in the Sharia court in the Supreme Court in Pakistan. Before that, Mr. Khalid Masud was the chairman of the Council for Islamic Ideology in Pakistan and general director for the Islamic Research Institute in the University of Islamabad in Pakistan. He was also the academic director for the Institute for the Study or Islam in the Modern World. And this is an institution that has to do with the Leiden University in the Netherlands. And he was also a teacher of Islamic law in the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He is a distinguished professor in Islamic law in the University of Malaysia, and he is also a senior teacher for the Center of Islamic Legal Studies in the University Asma Lubello in Nigeria. He is specialized in Islamic law, history of Islamic law in Southeast Asia and Spain, the theories of this law, modernity, and the current debates regarding Sharia. Apart from his more than 60 chapters in the book and hundreds of articles in several journals all around the world, his main publications are the books Shatterman Philosophy of Islamic Law, published in 1985, and I would like to mention that that is how I got to know the important work of Professor Khalid Masud. One book is also Iqbal's Reconstruction of Ijtihad, published also in 1985, and Sharia Today, published in 2013. He has also edited and co-edited several other books, in which we have Islamic Legal Interpretation in 1996, Travelers in Faith in the year 2000, Spain Injustice in Islam published in 2006, Islam and Modernity, published in 2009, Freedom of Expression in Islam, this is quite new, it was published this year, and he has another book coming, Sharia in the 21st Century. It is about to be published, and Hannah Jalul and myself participate in this in the edition of this book, and I'm the author of one of the chapters of this book, which is to be published very soon. I would like to highlight that he has a very important role as a researcher and also as a judge, and I would like to give him the floor. So the floor is yours, Mr. Masud.
Thank you, Delphina. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. I must begin by thanking Casa Arabe and Dr. Delphina Ruano, the organizer of this August series, and giving me the opportunity to speak on Shatibi's theory of objectives of Sharia. I am humbled in the presence of such great women and men of learning participating in these conferences. It is a great honor for me to be among them. Nevertheless, I must admit that it is impossible to do justice with the daunting volume of academic literature on the subject that offers critical and interpretive studies and is using these theories as an epistemological tool in areas like management, studies, economics, banking, biomedicine, and environmental contexts. My presentation focuses on Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, died in 1388. Sorry for the interruption. The presentation is divided into three sections. In the first section, I present summary of the main points of Shatibi's theory. In the second, an overview of the local context referring to the impasse that Islamic legal theory had reached in the 14th century, and Shatibi developed this theory as a way out. In the third section, I explore the intriguing title of al-Muwafaqat, which means reconciliation between the legal and theological theories, especially reconciling between Ibn Qasim, Maliki, and Abu Hanifa. In the first section, I begin with a modern critique of Shatibi's theory by the well-known Tunisian theologian Tahir ibn Ashur. Tahir ibn Ashur was the first scholar to write in 1946 a critical study of the theories of the subjectives of Sharia, of the objectives of Sharia. His critique paves the way to look back at the question why Shatibi developed his theory of the objectives of Sharia. Tahir ibn Ashur dismissed Shatibi's argument that the principle of jurisprudence are categorical. Ibn Ashur's word, وَمَا لَمْ يَأْتِ بِطَائِلٍ, translated by Professor Misawi as unsuccessful, conveys very mildly what the phrase really means in Arabic. Ibn Ashur rejected Shatibi's claim that all universal principles of jurisprudence are categorically conclusive. He disputed that the objectives could be discovered by inductive reasoning. In his view, inductive reasoning would provide only inconclusive results because it is never complete and exhaustive. Similarly, Ibn Ashur set aside Shatibi's detailed discussion of the objectives as unclear. According to him, Shatibi fell into the trap of long-winded and confused analysis, developing methodological precepts, and, to quote, omitted some crucial aspects of Sharia's higher objectives. He failed to reach the target that he had set for himself. To him, Shatibi's analysis was weak, casuistic, and rhetorical. Nonetheless, Ibn Ashur acknowledged that Shatibi made great contribution and that he would follow in his footsteps and would not neglect his teachings. Elaborating the universality of Sharia, Ibn Ashur discussed the principles of equality in Islamic law and explained the impediments to equality, both on gender and religious basis in Islamic law. He considered these impediments incidental. However, Ibn Ashur clarified that this is because correctness of belief is among the fundamentals of Islam, which means that the soundness of the faith of Zimmis, which means protected non-Muslims in a Muslim country, is considered deficiency according to Sharia. It is on this basis that they could not be entrusted with positions of controlling Muslim religious affairs. Accordingly, Muslim scholars agreed on preventing non-Muslims from holding certain official posts. End of the quote. Significantly, Ibn Ashur also pointed out to several areas in Islamic legal thought, especially relating economy and commerce, that could not be developed due to general attitude of restriction in the juristic literature. I need not dwell on how this interpretation of the fundamentals of Islam or the objectives of Sharia has created or will be creating another impasse today. I must speak, therefore, with utmost modesty on a subject that took Shatibi 4 volumes to elaborate and took me 4 years to write dissertation on only one of these volumes. For me, this is still a research in progress because it raises always new questions every time I want to write on this subject. The main point in Shatibi's theory is that Maslaha, or the human good, is the foundational objective of Sharia. This objective is known clearly by inductive and exhaustive readings of the primary sources, that is, Quran and Sunnah. Maslaha is not an additional principle like Maslaha Mursala that requires textual support to be valid. Inductive reading of the sources demonstrates that Maslaha that Maslaha is the first intent of God as lawgiver in his communications about legal obligations. And secondly, that it is the reason for the normativity of legal obedience. Maslaha, or human good, of the people is therefore the main objective of Sharia. Maslaha consists of 5 human interests, which are religion, life, reason, genealogy, and property, which Sharia aims to protect. Shatibi argues that validity of his claim is based on 2 premises. First, this is the evident conclusion reached by method of inductive reasoning of the sources. Secondly, these are universally practiced values and objectives. He says, Mura'at fi kulli millah. They are practiced by everyone. Shatibi considers ijtihad, or legal reasoning, as an objective, neutral, and independent science. He refers to some jurists who allow disbelievers, even atheists, exercising ijtihad because it is a method of reasoning that relies on premises that are assumed to be valid, regardless of whether they are so in reality. Shatibi elaborates Maslaha as a system of protection consisting of 3 levels of human good. necessities, needs, and cultural aesthetics, supported by several other supplementary and complementary legal considerations. He describes his system as concentric circles of protection, hima. That is in the slide shown how he explains that. Shatibi's contemporary jurists accused him of innovation and heresy. They disputed his method of inductive reasoning, but his prominent disciples, like Qazi Abu Bakr ibn Asim, died in 1425, defended the validity of inductive legal methodology. Shatibi and his teacher, Abu Sa'id ibn Lub, died in 1381, differed with each other about the definition of bid'ah and maslaha. Shatibi argued in his book, al-I'tisam, and in his fatwa, that bid'ah means making such matters part of religion and religious and legal obligation which do not originally belong to religion. Nevertheless, Shatibi's contribution was duly and continuously recognized in biographical sources. He came to prominence finally in the late 19th century and early 20th century when Al-Muwafaqat and Al-I'tisam were respectively published in 1884 and 1915. They were warmly welcomed in Egypt by Muhammad Abdu and his followers, in India by Muhammad Iqbal, and in Tunisia by Allal al-Fasi. These Islamic reformists found Shatibi's theory of objectives helpful in the reform and reconstruction of Islamic legal thought. To reiterate this, before I return to the next section, let me sum up the main points of Shatibi's theory. Number one, the primary objective of Sharia law is the protection of masalih al-ibad, or human good, consisting of the 5 human interests which Sharia aims to protect. Number two, it is communicated in the primary sources as the intent of the lawgiver, as a basis of obligation and the reason for human legal obedience in Islam. These interests are also universally recognized in all human societies. Number three, legal reasoning based on the objective is an independent systematic science. 5 objectives are supported by 3 concentric circles of universal, socio-legal, and cultural human interests. B, judicial ijtihad relies on the underlying reason in Sharia laws and employs 3 judicial processes: identifying precedents, distinguishing between the precedents, and locating the relevance to case in question to reach judgment. Number 4, this process allows non-Muslims, disbelievers, and even atheists who accept these objectives as basic framework and the method of reasoning to join Muslims in the process of legal reasoning. Let me now come to the second section, the historical context. Shatibi's Spain under the Nasrids, the last Muslim dynasty ruling Muslim Spain, was the Andalusia reduced to the city of Granada. Ongoing wars of reconquest by Christian kings had created political instability and weakened the political and social order. The ulama, muftis, and qazis enjoyed absolute religious authority in that system. Distinction between crop sharing and fruit production, between prompt access called ribal fadl and delayed access called usury, and commercial practices like ijara, hiring services, and the lease of land had led to the restrictions on economy. Agricultural economy that had provided prosperity was fading due to the limited space of land. Under the impact of mercantile trade rising in the 14th century Mediterranean countries, agricultural economies were transforming into commercial trading economies. There was a rapid growth of small metal, leather, dairy, and silk industries whose produce was largely meant for Mediterranean countries. Due to uncertainties in ownership, risk, and hazards in the process and profit distribution methods, muftis were reluctant to allow the new contracts of partnership and services as valid. In Shatibi's Granada, the partnership became further complicated, where single olive and mulberry trees were owned or leased to multiple persons. The market began to ignore Mufti's instructions. Sharia-abiding people sought fatwa, but Muftis could allow it only by invoking expediency doctrines. For example, Shatibi received a query about the validity of one of such practices. He offered a detailed analysis of this fatwa. The inquirer wrote that people were obliged to pool milk to make cheese. The owners of goats and sheep hired the services of herdsmen and experts collecting milk and making cheese. The inquirer suggested that it was analogous to mixing food at occasions of social feasts and events in which friends and relatives shared raw materials to prepare food, and together they ate and enjoyed. They found no problem. Shatibi replied that he did not know any specific precedent ruling in this case. Theoretically, he could not be allowed due to uncertainty. Unusual to his style, Shatibi offered detailed analysis of texts from Hadith, Quran, Maliki doctrines, and social practices. Regarding Hadith, he quoted Prophet Muhammad, his prohibition about the practice of sale of ripe with dried dates and other practices, something like unequal barter, but approved another practice that was barter of fresh dates with the dried ones in smaller quantity. Shatibi referred to the Quranic permission also for guardians to mix their affairs with orphans for their good. Allah knows the man who means mischief from the man who means good. And if Allah had wished, he could have put you into difficulties. He is indeed exalted in power wise. So these are two verses verses and hadith from which he concluded that in case they create difficulties, then the convenience should be adopted. Shatibi concluded Sharia means convenience. Hence, the ulama approved the practice of sharing food for the sake of mutual convenience, cooperation, and facilitation. But for the purpose of uncertainty and usury, which are prohibited, it was therefore lawful to ignore insignificant amount of gharar, risk, and riba usury or excess. Shatibi developed the theory of Maqasid in view of the impasse to which Islamic legal theory had reached in the socio-economic context in Andalus in the 14th century. Moving now to the third section, is the proper moment to turn to this question: why did Shatibi choose al-Muwafaqat as the title of the book on the subject? Imran Hassan Niazi, who translated this al-Muwafaqat, he translates al-Muwafaqat into English as reconciliation. Their full title, the reconciliation of the fundamentals of Islamic law. Reconciliation implies peace between two rivals. Who were these rivals? This question may help us to understand fully why Shatibi felt the need to write this book. The fuller story about this title is told by Shatibi in the preface of the book. It reveals that he had to choose between two titles. According to this story, he had originally chosen the title At-Tarif bi Asrar al-Taklif, definition of the secret meaning of obligation. In the meanwhile, his teacher told Shatibi about his curious dream. The teacher saw Shatibi carrying a book that he had completed. When asked, Shatibi explained that I call it al-Muwafaqat because I have succeeded in reconciling between Ibn al-Qasim and Abu Hanifa. I found further clue in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. In his chapter on the history of Islamic law and jurisprudence, Ibn Khaldun refers to a major division between the Hanafis and the theologians. They developed two different ways, which Ibn Khaldun calls the method of the Hanafis and the method of the theologians. According to him, the Hanafis theorized Sharia law on the basis of substantive legal cases, while the theologians pursued abstract theological theories about the sources of human knowledge about good and bad to define legal theory of Sharia. Ibn Khaldun recognized Abdul Jabbar, Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, Abu Hussein al-Basri, al-Juwaini, al-Ghazali, the five outstanding theorists of Islamic law. With the exception of al-Dabusi, who was a Hanafi, these theorists were primarily theologians. Al-Juwaini and al-Ghazali were Shafi jurists, but Abdul Jabbar and Basri both were Mu'tazilis and belonged to no school of law. Ibn Khaldun did not mention any Maliki jurists in this list. He did mention Ibn al-Hajib and Ibn al-Qarafi later, the famous teacher and disciple among the Maliki jurists. They were in the medieval period, and in their usul works, both followed the later Ashari theologians, particularly Fakhruddin al-Razi. Shatibi did not approve relying on the works of the later Maliki jurists like Ibn Hajib, who followed the methods of the theologian. Shatibi found that Ibn al-Qasim, the prominent companion and disciple of Imam Malik, was closer to Abu Hanifa than the two mentioned above. In Al-Muwafaqat, Shatibi disputed frequently with Al-Qarafi. For example, Abu Hanifa and Malik both agreed on the legal validity of the condition of divorce before marriage, Taliq fi talaq qabla nikah, or implicit or explicit intention of divorce at the time of marriage. Qarafi found this view by the two Imams problematic because it was contrary to the lawgiver's objectives in marriage. Malik and Ibn Qasim did not find that view contrary to the objectives of the law. According to the jurists, Islamic contract of marriage was not based on the condition of no divorce. Rafi believed that these views, even though held by the Imams, were in conflict with the objectives of marriage in Islamic law. Shatibi argued that the theological perspective on the objectives of law had led Maliki jurists to literal and narrow understanding of legal reasoning. Shatibi wanted to reconcile between this attitude that had led Maliki jurisprudence to an impasse in legal matters. Shatibi's quest for the reconciliation of Maliki jurisprudence with the Hanafi method makes sense in the light of the above discussion about the difference between theological and Hanafi jurisprudence. To conclude, Shatibi's quest for reconciliation between Maliki and Hanafi jurisprudence makes sense if we keep in mind Ibn Khaldun's observation about the ongoing debate on the nature of usul al-fiqh or the Islamic jurisprudence. The theological approach was based on the premise that human reason cannot discover good and bad and that there could be no law without divine revelation. Islamic jurisprudence was therefore the science of sources, and syllogistic legal reasoning restricted jurists to seek a clear evidence in the revealed sources. The juristic approach divided the sources of Islamic law into primary and secondary sources. The secondary sources, like maxims and principles, were derived from the substantive laws developed by the leading jurists. On the other hand, the legal concern was largely related to the basis of normativity and in reasonability and social practices. Shatibi's theory of two titles of the book alludes to these two perspectives in the debate: the quest for the basis of normativity and the reconciliation between Maliki and Hanafi jurisprudence. He refers continuously to reconciliation between the Hanafi method of istihsan and Maliki methods of istislah and istidlal. Let me end this presentation with a quote from Shatibi's Al-Muwaffaq. Since the concept of legal obligation relies on the stability of the social habits and customs of the people, it is necessary to examine the basis of habits as norms on which account people are subjected to obligation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Professor Masud.
Thank you very much, dear professor, for this conference, which has been very clear and comprehensive, although quite synthetic as well. I'm going to read some conclusions that Mr. Khalid Masud sent us. And before we conclude and we give the floor back to Javier Razón, I would like to remind you that the text translated into Spanish will be in the Hurak magazine. And in that magazine, in that publication, we will have all the presentations of these conferences, and we will also have other articles as well from academics and experts that were not able to participate in this conference cycle. Al-Shatibi developed the theory of the Maqasid in the context of an impasse because the legal reasoning was stuck in al-Andalus in the 14th century. As Mr. Masud said, Shatibi's theory had to do with a critical analysis of different debates, jurists, legal experts, regarding the sources, principles, and reasoning methods of the Islamic tradition. The main idea of this theory is that Maslaha is the foundational objective of Sharia, and this objective has to do with God's intention regarding humankind and their obligation to obey God's law. The study of Sharia led Shatibi to conclude that the objectives of Sharia had to do with the protection of religion, life, reason, genealogy, and propriety. Al-Shatibi mentioned that these had to do with concentrical circles that had to do with the protection of legal and cultural requirements and other additional legal reasonings. Al-Shatibi created certain debate with legal experts, but he also had several disciples that followed his example. Many centuries afterwards, Al-Shatibi theory started to attract the attention of Islamic scholars at the beginning of the 19th century. In this theory, we have a pathway to create an Islamic legal system in fields such as banking, bioethics, managing, environment, the economy, areas which were not considered to be within the realms of Islamic law, traditionally. These debates have also led to the expansion of this theory. We also have the presentation of Mr. Khalid Masud. So we have the main aspects of the al-Shatibi theory, and we also have the critical approach by Tahir ben Ashur. So without further ado, I would like to thank once again Dr. Khalid Masud for his participation today, and I will also like to give the floor to Mr. Javier Roson for the conclusion. Thank you, Delfina. Thank you, Professor Masud. First of all, I would like to conclude this conference with the idea of the need to know the context from a historic point of view, from a source's point of view, and also from a scholar's point of view. These experts are obviously experts in Islamic law, and they are crucial, they are fundamental to understand moral issues, the way of living of Muslim people currently. So it's necessary to have this analysis and to reach this balance. Before we conclude, I would like to remind you that next Tuesday, on the 22nd of June, says the speaker, we will have Professor Fernando Amerigo from the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, and we will have this virtual meeting also in YouTube and in Facebook to debate about the cooperation principle with Muslim populations, and in this case it has to do with the Spanish population. So I would like to thank you all, and we can conclude the meeting, and we thank everyone watching us, and thank you very much.